Hello again and welcome to another one of our ITS UK webinars talking about the effect of coronavirus on transport and on our industry as a whole. I've got three guests again this week, so let me introduce them to you. First of all, Sharon Kindleysides, who is an independent consultant and a former chair of ITS UK. Geoff Collins is a director at Jenoptik. And Neil Herron is the owner of Grid Smarter Cities. So let's get straight on with the discussion. And I'm going to start with you, Neil, because you've actually, almost by complete fluke, been working on a product that is almost perfectly timed to deliver a solution we really need at this very moment, which is GRIDLocal. So tell us more about it.
Right, it spins out of an Innovate-funded feasibility study proof of concept that we did 2018-2019, and the task was to help regenerate local high streets and empower local traders to engage with communities, buy local, keep it local, make that interaction as simple as possible, and that digital experience, creating a platform for traders to publish their daily specials and the community to be able to buy those specials from platform, and then facilitated by a crowdsourced delivery service, engaging with local taxi drivers in their downtime. And coming out the back of that, we felt the need to reignite that. We had interest from local authorities to build it out from a proof of concept alpha version into a beta version. And we were exploring it with one London borough when the COVID crisis kicked off. And what we've done is expedite development, rebranded as GRIDLocal. And what we're doing is providing that handshake between the local trader and the community, especially people who are self-isolating and can't get to the local shops anymore. And by virtue of the fact that we're now creating a virtual marketplace and a delivery service, we're hopefully going to be solving some of the problems when we get live in a few weeks' time.
So it's quite interesting when you say go live in a few weeks' time. How quickly can you turn this concept into something that works, and how quickly can you scale it up?
It's about testing out the bugs, developing the operational protocols. It's all right when you're doing a first proof of concept and you've got a closed pilot. We're currently doing a beta version, which has ironed out some of the bugs that we had in the first instance. The integrated payments are in there. We've got the handshake with the local taxi service as well. And given the fact that a lot of taxi drivers are suffering downtime at the moment, it's about getting them engaged quite quickly. So there is an interest there. There's an interest from the local traders. And what we want to do is to test it behind closed doors, then go live in a few weeks with a phased rollout across one city, and then look to explore the potential with other cities across the UK.
And what sort of interest are you getting for it, Neil?
Well, there's a massive amount of interest. We've used some test purchases with random customers, friends, family, work colleagues, friends of work colleagues, and the value is great. See the benefit and the value of being able to buy goods from their local traders who they wouldn't normally support, because you tend to do your weekly big shop, or you have been doing weekly big shops and not using local traders. Many of the home delivery stuff has now been massively impacted. Some of the major supermarkets are not being able to deliver, even to vulnerable people, for 4 to 6 weeks. And so what we're doing is helping the traders to re-engage with customers that they lost a few years ago.
Okay, we'll come back to Neil on this in a moment, but Geoff Collins of Jenoptik also joins us on the panel this week. And Geoff, again, I guess your usual work is around enforcement and speed enforcement using ANPR cameras. Have you been able to repurpose any of the data at all to help us maybe understand the changes in travel behaviour and spot any trends or anything?
Well, that's a good question, Paul, because generally the equipment that we supply is to monitor driver behaviour, particularly journeys made by a vehicle as they travel from one location to another. And in normal times, that is used to monitor traffic safety and to identify journeys which are dangerous, illegal journeys, which could cause risk to people on the road. People are doing things differently, both in the workplace and the way they're using the road at the moment. So we have been able to take some data anonymously from a number of our locations, because it gives a really good measure for what people are doing now and how driver behaviour has changed. So that data can be used to better understand what is happening. And so, for example, in line with the data which is being published during the daily briefings, we've seen a good 75% reduction in traffic volume typically across the road network. But there's a few interesting factors as well, in that the proportion of people who are still on the road that are speeding has gone up quite substantially. So as a population, if there used to be 10,000 vehicles on the road, and now there are 2,500 vehicles on the road, as a proportion of the 2,500, a lot more of them are going much too quick. But the actual total number of people who are violating is lower than it would be when there was a higher traffic volume. So there is a balance there between the overall number of people who are doing bad things is lower, but the proportion of people who are doing bad things is higher. And it depends on the type of road that you're dealing with, whether that is a significant issue and something that you need to take further measures against.
Well, I think it's interesting that people talk about why are they bothering with speeding tickets at the moment? Haven't they got more to think about? But actually, when you watch the daily briefing from Downing Street, it is stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. The whole point of lockdown isn't necessarily to stop us catching the virus, it's to stop the spike that overwhelms the NHS. You would think the meatheads, for want of a better word, who are speeding around the place might actually realise that in speeding they're increasing their chances of actually being in an accident, and therefore could well end up putting an unnecessary strain on the NHS.
I agree with that, and I think it's right. It's not a message that's fully percolated through to everybody. I've heard anecdotally of people who would normally be operating speed enforcement vans. Some of that has been taken back because of members of the public being abusive towards the people running the van, saying, shouldn't you be out doing something better when there's a crisis? But I think you're absolutely right, because if someone is driving at 100 miles an hour on a road that should be 50 miles an hour, the chance that they could themselves have a collision and injure themselves or injure somebody else is significantly higher. And that potentially means a critical care bed, which is taken away from somebody's relative that badly needs it through no fault of their own. So it's something I feel quite strongly about. If people think now is the time to go out and speed because they're the only one on the road, they are not thinking through fully their obligation to wider society, because you can protect the NHS by not driving like an idiot and then taking up a hospital bed.
Now, I remember those long forgotten days when we were actually able to travel places. I was in Melbourne for the ITS World Congress in 2016 and talking to your Jenoptik colleagues in Australia. And there, the same technology is being used for much better understanding of not only speeding but also speeds on roads, so you can understand speed and flow as far as traffic management is concerned, and also tracking vehicles, so you understand and can model using that data. And that kind of business opportunity was closed off to you here in the UK because you're very tightly restricted as to what you can use the data for as part of the regulations. Is it straightforward to actually, in this time of crisis, tweak the allowance of what you can use the data for, or are you having to go through any hoops before you can actually start to use the data for more than speed enforcement?
Well, I think it's fair to say the law has not changed. So where there was a legal reason why you couldn't do something, that legal reason has not gone away. There's usually a pragmatic way through any situation. So I think you may be referring to, in the UK, Home Office type approval means that the data, you cannot use it for two purposes at the same time. It's doing one thing or it's doing another thing. And there are pragmatic ways around doing that. So you don't have to use the data for two purposes at the same time. You can stop using it for one and use it for another, and then manage that carefully and appropriately. But I think it is fair to say that certainly government agencies have their eyes open to the fact that data, when it is of value and is useful, that can trump concerns that you may have at other times about the way things are used, as long as you stay within the law and everything is done appropriately. And there is definitely an interest in having an access to big data that gives you an idea about traffic flows, volumes, how it changes from hour to hour, day to day, month to month, different types of journeys, whether they're short or long. So the data really can be used to identify trends and behaviours, and I think it will help to guide intelligent decisions and interventions if needed. So data really is always important, but now I think particularly it's important.
Let's bring Sharon in now. Now, Sharon Kindleysides, for a long time you ran CAPS Traffic Con here in the UK, and you spent just over a year at the Roads and Traffic Authority in Sydney, running the traffic control centre there. If you had still been in Sydney trying to run a major megacities transport infrastructure, how would you have approached the situation we're in at the moment?
It's actually quite interesting what they have done down in Sydney. One of the examples I was going to make, one of the first things they did was they wanted to stop people touching the pedestrian crossing buttons. So they've actually either put sensors in or automated the triggering pedestrian crossings, and they've put big signs up over the buttons telling people not to touch them. So I think whether or not it'll sort of affect the spread of the virus, I don't know, but it struck me as being a very interesting approach to sort of say, actually, you don't need to press this button, we can do it automatically for you. So I think had I still been in Sydney, a lot of what we'd have been doing was trying to make sure we could keep things going, particularly with the workforce being quite spread out. You know, people would have been working from home, and Australia's broadband is notoriously slow, so I can imagine they're going to have a lot of problems. But I think it would also be Australia's quite car dependent. People aren't that keen on public transport. And I think a lot of this message about only travel if you need to might have helped to get people to consider what they were doing with their cars. And I've seen some pictures of colleagues who are still there, and they've taken pictures of Sydney Harbour, sort of showing how the pollution's going down already just by there being fewer vehicles on the road. So I think it is really interesting. And what Geoff was saying about the data, I think when all this is over and done with, the modal shift will be really interesting. My gut feel is people have come away from public transport and gone to cars because they feel safer. As Geoff was saying, that might not mean that they're behaving themselves in their cars. They may just see a big empty road and are driving faster. So I think when this is all over, we're going to have to be very careful about encouraging people back onto public transport, because we don't want them sitting in their car every day making congestion worse than it was before.
I think it's interesting what you say there, Sharon, because when I worked in Australia for a while, I remember taking the train from North Sydney into the central business district, and the colleagues of mine in the office were stunned. They were like, hang on a second, you're an executive, you don't take the train, get a taxi. And the attitude was, once you had reached a certain level of seniority, you then travelled in a car. You didn't go on the trains or buses. They were for lower paid ordinary people, was the kind of view that sort of came across in Sydney. Now, that's what we touched on this last week, the almost contradiction between the fact that air quality appears, we don't know yet, obviously, because we're still learning, but it appears the worst hit areas in the world for the virus are areas with bad air quality. So you want to reduce reliance on the car, but then on the other hand, social distancing means that the idea of mobility as a service and everybody having shared mobility is going to be less attractive, because you can sit in your own little cocoon of a car and avoid any other people.
Yeah, I think that's true. And as you're saying, especially in Australia, they've just got the metro going in Sydney now and their light rail. And probably this would have been the absolute peak time for them getting people out of their cars. And now almost giving them another message. So it's going to be interesting, particularly for startups all around the world who are sort of aiming at the mobility as a service field. How are they going to cope with this sort of shock or sort of pause? It's probably going to put them back about 6 months, I would have thought. And I think a lot of startups aren't necessarily going to be big enough to be able to keep going. So I think, I mean, it's not the most pressing issue, but I think when we come out the other side, it's going to be interesting to see which companies have actually managed to survive and where people decide to concentrate their efforts going forwards.
I think it's interesting that the companies that are most confident about where they're going to go in the future and what how successful they're going to be and will they survive are the companies that are as flexible as possible. So let's go to the micro SME level of yourself, Sharon. How have you found things since everything changed a month or so ago? Have you found new opportunities, or have you just found that certain bits of work have begun to dry up?
Pretty much everything came to a grinding halt, or at least paid work. There's quite a lot of voluntary stuff out there, even in our field. I've been plugging the Innovate UK funding competitions quite widely, and obviously they've gone out to the private sector for people to help assess. But I think a lot of the big companies are really trying to work out themselves, have we got the right staff? What are we doing? I've been doing some work on a big procurement. How do you hold negotiations for multinational companies remotely over several time zones? So I think at the moment, everyone's sort of gone into a bit of a limbo. And I think this week now after Easter, people are going to go, okay, this now is the new normal. How do we cope going forward? I think a lot of people were sort of hoping maybe that the announcement yesterday would have been great, everybody back to work. But it certainly looks like we're going to be at home for another, probably till the end of April or the middle of May. So I think now's the time where people are going to have to start thinking how they're going to move forwards. And certainly one of the things I've been trying to do is connect with lots and lots of people on LinkedIn. Just sort of saying, I can help, look, I'm here. The advantage of being small is I might be able to see things differently or have a different viewpoint. But again, in our industry, it's going to be tricky for everybody for a while yet, I think. So
you as an expert in the industry of, and I hate to say this to you, Sharon, many years, you listened to what Geoff and Neil said about the innovations that have come out of this crisis. And obviously Neil had been working on his for a while, but now is the perfect time to introduce this as we try and shop personally less, yet there is a strain on the big supermarkets deliveries, and obviously Geoff repurposing some of the stuff he does to help a better understanding. What would you recommend to companies at the moment? How would you recommend that they look at what they're doing and try and take advantage is the wrong word, or the wrong phrase, but actually repurpose things to help us in these unprecedented times?
I think there's sort of two ways of looking at this. What Neil said was really interesting. I think where I live, which is relatively rural, one of the local taxi companies has actually signed up with some of the local restaurants, and they've got an informal partnership for delivering food. I mean, that works where you've got 24,000 people and maybe 5 takeaways. But I think the platform Neil was proposing sounds fantastic. And I think a lot of businesses should look at what's going on in their locality. People are getting their food, their pharmacies via adverts on Facebook at the moment. So I think it's taking it back to the locality. But also the bigger companies that maybe has got a bit more time. As I say, both Innovate UK and DASA have got open calls out at the moment. And they just want companies to come along with ideas, any idea in the COVID-19 space, to make proposals about how they might be able to help. And you're also seeing a lot of people repurposing factories. I saw a picture that Barber, who usually make Barber jackets, have been making scrubs. So I think there's a bit of lateral thinking has to go on. what can you actually do with what you've got? But I think certainly concentrate on the locality, because that's where the help needs to be. London's probably well served. It's, the Fens and the north of England where a bit more help's needed.
And Neil, have you had a chance to actually even think about developing GRIDLocal any further? Or is it just spending every waking moment turning it faster than you probably expected to into something that's going to start delivering a real difference for people?
Sharon saying as well.
Sorry, can you start? I've muted you. Sorry. If you could just unmute, just start again, please, Neil. That'd be great. Thanks.
So we have to be agile as well as being fragile. As a tech startup, you are massively exposed to the new market which is emerging, and by being able to be agile and move across and expedite some of the resource from what it was working on into this new way of doing things for GRIDLocal, we're ready to hit the ground running. But then it's about scale, and scale requires investment and uptake, and it's about then how you cope with the capacity. Because if it takes off, it's going to take off in a massive way. Because all you're doing is going trader, customer, join them together. If you do that once, you can do it 10 times, you can do it 1,000 times, you can do it 100,000 units across the UK quite quickly. And it's about being able to scale to meet that demand. But we are, as a small business, falling between the cracks because we are pre-revenue, so we don't qualify for business loans. We can't furlough staff because the staff are needed to develop the new applications. So it is a difficult time for us.
I was chatting to somebody before we started this webinar, talking about an idea he had for a startup, and he had actually been in quite advanced conversations with venture caps just at the point all this hit. And of course, they've put things on hold themselves. If you wanted investment, Neil, is it there at the moment, or is that just not even worth looking at?
No, you've still got to continue business as usual, which is continuing the dialogue with investors, preparing the business plans. And if we've got a business plan that's going to fill the gap between getting food that currently exists, or that there is a gap there that does exist, and we're going to plug that gap, then it's a route that we need to go down for society's benefit as well as the commercial benefit as well. And this is about building a platform that can enable people to do that. So the business plan is prepared, just about finished for the second rollout. And there's an Innovate call at the moment, the COVID-19 call, where they're funding £20 million behind 400 businesses. And we've got an application going into that as well to help expedite this.
Okay, go back to Geoff for a second. Geoff, one of the things that we picked up on at the end of the last webinar was almost a frustration at the fact that this is exactly the moment when it would be great to be able to do some work on the transport network because demand is so low compared to normal. But of course, social distancing means that you can't send people out onto the roads to do the work. Have you got an issue at the moment with any maintenance of your camera network where you're just not being able to get to them? Or is it pretty much holding up, or are you finding you're okay and you're allowed to send any engineers out to do any work that's needed?
It's very much a mixed bag at the moment, I think it's fair to say. The likes of Highways England are very clear to say it's business as usual. The highway is a critical national infrastructure project, so anything you can do to keep it flowing has to carry on. So that enables you to do things. But then on the flip side, we have partners we work with who have put all of their staff on furlough because that is an easy option. So you maybe have the opportunity to do something, but not the resource to do it. Contrasted with some local authorities that are very much trying to keep anything off the road that they can keep off the road. But where you can do something, usually most projects can be delivered in an appropriate way with social distancing, but there are certain projects where physically you need two people to lift something in close proximity, and it makes it difficult. So as with many things, it's not a completely black and white situation. There are some things where there is actually an increased opportunity, and there are other areas where nothing can happen at the moment, and it's a matter of trying to understand a a route through that is practical, and will keep you going in the short term, the medium term, and the long term.
And I just want to pick up on one last thing, Geoff, which is as a multinational, when Jenoptik bought Visionics, and obviously you then became a part of a big international company, how has that been since lockdown and since different countries have taken different steps towards coping with the virus? Have you been sharing best practice, or have you basically just moved back and said, right, we're in the UK, let's just concentrate on this, and our colleagues elsewhere can concentrate on what's important to them?
It's an interesting question. I don't think there's one particularly clear answer, but when you come to a time of crisis, I think usually your boundaries restrict a little and you look immediately after the things that you can protect. So I think it's fair to say there are top level ideas and guidelines which are shared, but different governments have taken a different approach to how things should be done. And I think the priority is always on getting things right where your people are at that time, and where possible tying it into a wider picture. But it's a mixture of top level and lower level monitoring, management, and decision making.
And just quickly, all three of you, we had a survey at ITS UK of companies that are members of the organisation. We did on behalf of the Department of Transport, and actually, despite the majority of the companies being extremely adversely affected by what's going on at the moment, confidence remains relatively high. For the three of you, are you confident that as and when we come out of this, the other side, there are opportunities, and that you and your companies are going to be okay? We'll start with you, Geoff, because you're here at the moment.
I think longer term, absolutely. Life goes on; things do come back to normal, but it's the strange shaped effort curve between now and then, and I don't think anyone quite understands exactly the shape and the profile of it. So I see lots of things are happening right now, and then there's a pool in the middle where no one is entirely sure what's going to happen, and then there's going to be a whole lot of work and effort that comes further along. So it's a matter of managing the way through that. But I think it is going to bring up new opportunities and new ways of doing things. And that's true across the entire space, not just our company or our industry. Things are going to work differently. It will be different in future. I mean, what we're doing right now is not something we would have contemplated doing probably 2 months ago. But we are doing things in a different way. And I think that will continue. And that always brings opportunities.
I think where we're at the moment, we're going to never see the same again going forward. And we like to think that we deliver effective, practical and simple solutions, and we're agile enough to be entrepreneurial enough to take advantage of what needs to be done in the future and how it needs to be done, even if it's a different way of working and different way of looking at problems and delivering solutions to fit the problems, rather than just technology for technology's sake. And I think there's going to be a massive readjustment beyond this. Travelling from the northeast for a 1 hour meeting in London and then travelling back in the same day just now seems ridiculous to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to change the way we all work. It's going to be very hard for people to get back into an environment, I think, where they have to sit at their desk for 8 hours a day. And I think sort of concentration spans will take a while to get back to normal. I also think it'll show what is and isn't digitally possible. I'm always very keen on digital inclusivity and making sure nobody's left behind. And I think one thing this will really prove is what percentage of the people don't have digital access. And I think in future systems will probably be better designed to include them. But I think we've got a little while to go yet, and I think it's going to be harder before it gets back to normal.
Sharon Kindleysides, Neil Herron and Geoff Collins, thank you very much for, actually, I think compared to maybe last week, which I finished recording and thought was a bit depressed at the whole situation at the moment. Here we've seen a couple of innovative solutions and some ideas and some thoughts about how to get through this, and actually to use ITS to deliver real practical solutions. So I feel slightly better at the end of this webinar. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for watching, and join me again next week as we'll have an international flavour to our coronavirus discussion here from ITS UK. Thanks for watching.